Welcome to the Mastering the Game of Life podcast. In this podcast, there'll be insights around 3 key areas to mastering the game of life: purpose, prosperity, philanthropy. Your host, Paul Lowe, the third sector mentor, is the founder of Hearts Global CIC, which along with many other of his charitable commitments has been responsible for positively impacting thousands of people's lives, particularly young people from disadvantaged communities. Author of Mastering the Game of Life, From Pain to Purpose, and Speaking from Our Hearts books. Introducing your host, Paul Lowe.
Hello listeners, and welcome to this podcast where we'll be talking about the subject of grief, and more specifically how grief can be overcome. Now this is a subject, if that's the right word, that affects all of us to varying degrees or other, and sometimes in our life. And certainly from my experience, it's something that people do get, I would say, paralysed by. And the message today is that doesn't need to be the case. And to help convey that message, I've got a lady with me called Cherri Forsyth. Cherri did a previous podcast episode, you may recall, around the trauma of losing a daughter, adultery, and overcoming crippling illness. And today she's going to share with us, based on her own personal experience, her research, and her whole sort of putting all this together, the benefits of her experience. So without further ado, Cherri, it's over to you, and tell us about grief.
Thank you, Paul. And as always, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be able to discuss things with our listeners and with you. I do feel that in our Western culture, we really don't deal with grief very well at all. We kind of have the stiff upper lip approach where, you know, once it's a week after the loss maybe, and so one is immediately expected to be, you know, totally back to normal, getting on with things, be totally unaffected by which in many cases is a very great loss. You know, either the loss of a parent, a spouse, a very close friend, or maybe a child. And so our Western culture kind of dismisses grief as not important and something you get over quickly, and it's almost like an illness, like you've had a bit of a cold. You'll get over it, and then you'll go back to being your normal self again. And I think that that's where a lot of misunderstanding happens. If it is the loss, Paul, of somebody not particularly close to you, then certainly to be able to get over it much more quickly is absolutely appropriate. But if it's a loss of somebody really, really close to you, I don't believe that you can ever go back to being your normal old self again. I believe that the process of grieving, if you allow it to, really weathers our soul, really, I suppose we harness that hardship and the learning that happens to us during the grieving process it's huge. And that learning doesn't allow us to be our old normal selves, but it certainly does allow us to be a new normal self in time. And in our Western culture, I don't think we allow the process, encourage the process. We're expecting people just to kind of shake it off and carry on with life. And I think that attitude is very damaging for people who are in the process of mourning for a loved one.
So if I'm hearing you correctly then, Cherri, and we know this to be true as a generalisation, about the need for each and every one of us to constantly almost reinvent ourselves. So if I'm hearing you correctly, is that what you're saying, that the grief actually probably expedites that process even more? Because whilst we may recognise that pain in small doses is very good because it's a great lever for change, suffering certainly isn't. There's no benefits to suffering at all. Are we putting grief then under that banner of suffering, and there are no benefits unless we can use it as a very strong, powerful lever for change, for the better, obviously?
Yes, Paul, that's exactly it. We would never choose to have that kind of suffering, but when you're in it, you do have a choice, and that is either to harness the suffering, the pain, the enormity of what's happened to you, and over time allow it to transform you. Or the other choice is to not allow the grief to do any work for you at all. You get stuck in that dark place. You become a victim, and that's where you remain. And many people don't realize that when they are in the midst of their grieving process, that they are able to have that choice to remain a victim or to choose to allow the journey to teach us what it needs to teach us, so that we then come out far more compassionate, far more understanding, not only of others who are grieving, but just in the general way we live our lives.
Okay, so allow me to play devil's advocate on that, Cherri, if I may.
Sure.
It's okay for you to say that. My heart's broken. You don't understand. How would you come back and rationalise overcoming grief? Because on a personal level, I totally resonate with what you've said and know it to be true. But I also have conversations with a lot of people that I call it the us and them syndrome, where they don't actually sort of see or because their heart's broken, they haven't that in the moment, that ability to see, to see the forest for the trees, to use that metaphor. They're so immersed in this crippling, paralyzed state of grief that they can't see any other. So how would you, what's the message, I suppose, of inspiration that you'd give to people that are newly grief-stricken, I suppose is the correct way to put it?
Lovely question, Paul. And in fact, it's a question that I often come across because I do deal a lot with particularly parents who've lost children, but also we have a huge retirement village very close to us. So I deal a lot with people who've lost their partners of a lifetime. And, initially that process, you are heartbroken. It's a very debilitating place to be when you have just experienced the loss. And even though our body does protect us by suffusing ourselves with all sorts of chemicals that make us numb, which is a way of protecting our bodies, once that numbness starts wearing off, and reality really starts hitting home, that is when the pain is probably at its worst, because we don't have any chemicals that are protecting us anymore. And so when one is in that stage, I think what people need to know is that there is a process that they will need to go through. It's not going to be just, waving a magic wand and making it go away. So I don't like to try and pretend that the journey they are going to be walking is an easy one. So I think what the first step for me is to really validate where they are, and to let them know that it is completely normal to feel such intense pain, to feel there's a myriad of symptoms that go together with the grieving process. And so firstly, to validate, absolutely, I do understand. And then from there to say, however, over time, it certainly eases a lot. And the more you work through your grief, generally, the quicker that process is, where you travel down through the valley of grief and you start coming up the other side. So the comment that time heals, I don't believe is entirely true. What I like to say is, yes, we do need the process of time to help us, but it's what we do with that time that really will determine how strongly we overcome the grieving process, or maybe how positively we overcome the process of grieving.
Yeah, because that time concept for me, Cherri, just stepping outside this specific context of grief, I mean, time as a generalization, I firmly believe is a man-made concept. You know, we have watches, we have clocks that guide us they tell us how to kind of practically live our lives. You know, I will get up at 8 o'clock in the morning, at 12 o'clock I will go to work. You know, they're kind of benchmarks throughout our day. But isn't the reality with the human spirit particularly, and in life in more general terms, that the fact that time is time? You know, oh, I wish I had more time. Well, you've got the same amount of time as every single person on this earth has got. It's how we perceive that. And I think when our heart is breaking, the old cliche, oh, do you know, a minute seems like an hour, seems like a day. But when your life is good and you're having fun, didn't time go quickly? No, it didn't. It's your perception. And I think that's for me, an interesting insight in terms of that grieving process. How long does that take? You know, you hear people ask the question, well, you know, this has just gone off in my life. How long will it take? They say that time's a healer. Well, how long is that? It's very, very subjective, and you cannot, for me, I don't believe you can put a time scale on that, because, as I say, that's a man-made construct anyway.
Absolutely. I fully agree, Paul. Particularly in recovering from a trauma, and again, we can go broader than just grief, but in recovering from any kind of really negative experience, you know, my answer to how long is it going to take is, you know, how long is a piece of string? It's a very personal process, and it won't, you know, there are no hard and fast rules about how long it will take. So just to give you an example, I chatted to a woman who had lost her daughter, and this was very early on. I was trying to get some kind of guidance for myself. And she said to me, you know, after about 4 years, she felt she was totally in control of the process of grieving, and she could choose when she wanted to open the little box of grief and dig inside it or not. You know, up until that time, the grief was quite overpowering for her. And so she felt that the grief was in control of her life rather than the other way around. So she said it was after about 4 years she felt she could be in control of her grieving process. I'd like to compare that 4 years with that of my husband, who I think only started grieving because he blocked it out so badly, maybe 11 years after she died.
Yeah.
So, you know, when you come to the timing of it, it's such a personal journey that there are many things that you can't make a hard and fast rule on as far as the grieving journey is concerned. But one of them is the time of it. You know, what will affect the timing will be what the relationship was of that person who has died, how close were they to you, if there's any kind of complicating issues, like, you know, maybe you'd had a big fight, you know, just before he drove off in his car and then he had a car accident and was killed. Those kind of complicating factors will probably mean that you'll take that little bit longer to overcome the grief. Or if it's like maybe a suicide and there might be recriminations or guilt or feelings of I should have known or I could have done more to prevent the death. All those kind of factors will affect the time frame that we take to come to terms with the loss. I don't want to say get over it. There's a lovely term called emotional completion, which I think really does, for me, say what it is. We're wanting to come to the completion of the huge emotional turmoil of the journey through loss. And so I don't like to say you'll get over it, but I do like to say you'll come out the other side and you will be stronger and better, providing you allow the journey to do its work.
Yes, and that leads me nicely in, Cherri, to my next take on this around consciousness and, being aware of what is actually happening in any given moment, in any given day, hour, minute, second, whatever that may be. Because as we know, when we're in this phase of loss, if we can generalize it like that, it's our emotions are all over the place. So I use the word consciousness in a very simplistic sort of angle to say, okay, by me having, although my heart is breaking now and I feel absolutely dreadful and full of despair, and I've personally been in this, this situation many times, but having that, I don't know if ability is the right word, but that somehow to say, I will come through this, and I will, and I've used language like I will fight this battle, and I've since been challenged over we're using words like battle and give it empowering that sort of debilitation. But I suppose what I'm trying to say is by having a positive mindset, although you're fully aware and you're fully in the moment of pain and suffering and grief, to what degree do you think that having that consciousness, that positive mindset can help the process? Or is it just a natural time, bearing in mind what we've said about time, nature's just got to take its course? Or is it a hybrid of the two? What is it in your experience, Cherri?
I think, Paul, for me, having that positive mindset is such a gift in just in general living, but certainly when you are experiencing a dark and very painful process. I think what it allows one to do is it allows you to know that things will get better in time. Whereas if you don't have that positive mindset, you can't know that they'll ever get better. So what we're speaking about here is hope.
Yes.
So if you have a positive mindset, I think there's less anxiety around how powerful is this journey going to be? Is it going to destroy me? If you have a positive mindset, the going is tough. And realistically, you can sit in the moment, in the pain, in the heartbreak, but that in time, and using that word again, in time, but in time that you will be able to function again. So I do think that having a positive mindset plays an enormous role in, sorry, there's a huge truck going past. I hope it didn't drown out my sound too much. Having a positive mindset plays an enormous role in your knowledge that you will be able to overcome the grieving process. If you don't have that positive mindset, I think what often happens is there's a lot of anxiety around, is this going to stay like this forever? Am I ever going to be able to feel any joy again? Is it just going to be dark day on top of dark day on top of dark day? And I don't know, in fact, that I can ever feel better. And that mindset is the mindset which leads us into, I believe, into the victimhood of well, I'm going to stay here. It's comfortable for me. And so instead of me trying to learn about the process or trying to find out how I can maybe get out of these really crippling and hugely powerful emotions, people just stay there and allow those emotions to engulf them. And it's so sad, because then they stay in that terrible place for such a long time, instead of realizing that, in fact, if they put a little bit of work, emotional work, they can be in a very different place. So to answer your question, yes, I do think that a positive mindset plays a huge role in your ability to overcome the journey of loss. And part of it is because if one has a positive mindset, we generally are quite accepting of the reality of where we are. We're not trying to pretend that it's not a big thing, and we're also not trying to over-dramatize it. So I think that if you are blessed with a positive mindset, it helps a lot in the grieving process. The other thing that I think maybe I'm just going to toss in here is what also affects your ability to grieve or your ability to overcome or get into a more positive place is your own physical condition. So if you think of two elderly people who are both relatively frail and one dies, the remaining spouse is usually quite, let's say they're in their 90s, they're probably quite ill themselves, they're frail, they're weak. It's very difficult then to have a hugely positive mindset, because your own body is in a weak place and your mind is also in a weak place. So that's quite a tough situation to be in.
Okay. Brings in the question really of support, doesn't it? I want to park that support concept for a moment, Cherri, if I may. Just picking up there on your, you used the sort of polarization, and it's led in quite nicely to that victor versus victim dichotomy, and for me, this then brings in the 6 human needs, because. And yet again, I speak from my own personal experience of how my perceived early challenges in life, which were very stark, fed my certainly my first 4 core human needs, which are certainty, uncertainty, significance, and love and connection, working off the Tony Robbins model. And they served them in a very, very negative way, which led to addiction for me. So I'm very mindful that how grief, for example, can give us certainty, because you know that day after day after day after day, certainly in the early phases, that way of feeling, of being, is going to be very certain in your life. You'll know you're going to feel that way today, tomorrow, next week, next month, probably next year, probably the year after. Who knows? Bearing in mind our conversation around time. But there's a lot of certainty in grief, isn't there? Even though it's negative. Similarly with uncertainty or variety, you don't quite know how you're going to feel. You know you're going to feel bad, or you think you're going to be feeling bad, which then creates almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, because what you tell yourself is what you become, as we know. So it becomes a bit like a dog chasing its tail, round and round and round and round and round, but we're not really getting anywhere. And then when we look at the third one, significance, and I look, yet again, Cherri, at my own experience, and I'm going to invite you to sort of come in on the significance angle, if you was aware or not, or to what degree significance there was in terms of, managing the grieving process, because I can only elaborate on my own experience, and that was, it gave me great victimhood status. People felt sorry for me until I actually realised that that's a nonsense. I need to become a Victor now. I suppose the female equivalent would be Victoria, but I don't know if that quite fits. So there's, and then the love and connection as the fourth basic human need is, usually we can reach out to people because that empathise or share our common plight, if you like. So what's your thoughts around those certainly those first four basic human needs, Cherri, in terms of putting it in the context of a victor or a Victoria versus a victim?
Yeah, I agree, 100% with you. And as you know, we use the Tony Robbins's needs often in our coaching.
Yes.
But to relate that to grieving, the certainty of knowing it's going to be painful, exactly what you said, the process is awful. If you are looking for some kind of certainty in the initial stages of grieving, you ain't going to find them there. Okay, it is an incredibly volatile journey. It's a roller coaster of emotions. There is no certainty. You don't know from minute to minute how you're going to be feeling, let alone from day to day. So, I'm a very calm person, and I found that first little while, I never knew how I was going to be, whether I would be okay, whether I would be in floods of tears. So there was absolutely no certainty in the beginning. But then I think there can become a certainty as you realize I am going to overcome this. That certainty can motivate you and drive you towards the process, towards the positivity of overcoming the grieving process. So that's really dealing with the certainty and the uncertainty and variety, which is very much what you said. As far as the significance is concerned, I think you get a lot of significance if you choose to be the victim, and that's why many people stay there. Lots of people are running around them, they're becoming completely helpless. People are doing their shopping for them, making food for them. And that's actually really quite cool because then I don't have to do it myself. So, and I do know of a woman who actually lived in the same retirement village as my parents. And she lost a daughter like 45 years ago. And from that day on, she stopped living. She chose to remain in the victimhood. So her husband, she chose to stop living, but she was still breathing, if you know what I mean. She never did anything. She never did any cooking, never cleaning, never any buying. Her husband actually took over her life completely. So that can happen when you find being a victim is quite comfortable. What we need to try and harness is, so what kind of significance has the loss maybe given me? In other words, if I am in a situation where I'm well known in my village, maybe what I can do is I can be an example to other people in how to deal with their grief. And so what we found is in our tiny little village, everybody did know. And so because I was also, my husband had lived here his whole life, we'd been very involved in the community. What it did was it did allow us to, I suppose, show people that it was okay to grieve. Instead of trying to block it off and pretending that life was absolutely perfect, we allowed our village to see that we were grieving, but in a realistic way. I'm not sure if that's making sense to you, Paul, or to our listeners. But because we were known, we were able to influence others into saying it is a huge thing. We're not trying to pretend that this is just going away in a week. but we are going to be working through it in order to get to a positive, healthier place. And it did take my husband a very long time, but, we are there. So I think that's how significance would come into the grieving process. And then the last of the four core human needs, being love and connection, I do think that in a time of grieving, that support that we receive from our families, from our friends, from our communities, and the world is a small community now. There's online support groups. I think that is absolutely amazing. We were certainly overwhelmed with people we didn't know very well who would bring us a meal. So that kind of outpouring of love and connection is really so soothing for us in a time of huge grief. But I would just like to add here that sometimes the people that we think will really care for us don't. And possibly because they don't know how to. And that can be very hurtful. There might be close family members or close friends that you just imagine will walk the journey with you, and suddenly they're not alongside you. So that part of love and connection can lead to hurt. But on the other hand, there will be people that you are not expecting love and connection and support and caring from, and suddenly they reveal themselves to you. So on the one hand, relationships are maybe taken away, but on the other, new ones are given to you. So many people are unaware of the fact that sometimes close relationships can break down when there's a very important loss that you're trying to deal with. And so there's a double whammy of the fact that you have been, you're battling with the loss of the person that you loved, and then you battle with the loss of possibly close family members or friends who actually are not supporting you or walking the journey with you. And we certainly experienced that and have found that to be very painful.
I can, if I can just share a little bit of an anecdotal one on that, what I termed at the time, and this is going back a few years ago now, Cherri, people coming out the woodwork. I had a situation where I was up in Staffordshire visiting somebody. Well, actually, I was down in Warwickshire, but I was travelling up to Staffordshire. And as I'd come out of this meeting in Warwickshire, I put my phone on, and it went absolutely crazy. Now, this was about, 12 years ago? Mm-hmm. And it went absolutely crazy with messages, text messages, voicemails, this, that, the other. The phone was then ringing. So I'd switched the phone on and started taking, and Paul, give us a call. Paul, give us a call. Are you okay? Now, before I started taking the calls, I actually started working through the text messages and that. And one of them, the first one, actually said, Paul, we've heard you're dead, but give us a call, which I thought was quite humorous, because I thought, well, if I'm dead, how can I give you a call? But that it was interesting. That alarmed me, but amused me in equal measures at the time. And the upshot of this was, at the time, there was a guy with the same name as me that lived probably a couple of miles from where I lived originally, an area called Bestwood Estate in the inner suburbs of Nottingham, proper real inner city council estate. And he was the same age and all this kind of stuff. Now, what my drinking fraternity mainly had seen, but not just the drinking fraternity, was in the local paper's obituary column about this guy called Paul Lowe dying. And the connections or the coincidences, and as you know, Cherri, from our conversations, I absolutely do not buy into the coincidence thing in life. I do not.
Yeah.
I believe we put an energy out there, most of the time subconsciously, and we attract things that come back to us and which we may not like, understand, comprehend. But I actually wrote a poem around this once, and these things come back, and we must rest assured they're part of our journey.
Yes, I agree.
And for me, that is the epitome of faith. But anyway, I digress. So what happened was, within this situation, this guy, as I say, but the messages in the obituary, there were two in particular that was, I mean, this was uncanny in the extreme, that there was a reference to all your drinking buddies in Spain. Now, at the time when I was more in the UK, I used to go over to Spain regularly on a drinking binge, usually in Benidorm and around that area. And it stipulated that, it mentioned Benidorm, it mentioned Spain, etc., etc. It also mentioned in a separate obituary piece reference to Nottingham Forest Football Club, and it said, give our love to Cloughie, two great Forest lads together now, were the exact words, and Brian Clough obviously being the manager of Nottingham Forest for 18 years. So that was uncanny. So it wasn't hard to understand, Cherri, why people had deduced that it was actually me, because to all intents and purposes, it was me. Now, I looked into this, and it was actually legitimate. There was a guy with the same... This was all above board, because it freaked me out. There must have been 200 calls, text messages, this, that, the other, whatever. Now, the real sort of, to take it back to what you said about people, or to use my terminology, of people coming out the woodwork, at the time, I'd got two, and I use the term sworn enemies, and I mean that in the most starkest sense. These guys actually came into my local pub and said, this has gone off in the past, that's gone off in the past, shake your hand, buy you a drink, I'm glad you're alive. We're never going to be mates, we're at opposite ends of life's views, let's just leave it at that, because I was in some dark places in those days, but respect to you that you're alive. Now that moved me, and still moved me to this day, Cherri, to think that two people that you, and I won't use the word hate, because that's a very powerful word, and I refuse to buy into that, but disliked intent, just let's say we didn't see eye to eye, and I'm being really polite there, but they'd come out the way, they'd come out the woodwork, and it really put me on my sort of back feet to think, well, hang on, maybe you've got this game of life wrong, because your perception is they are the last two people you would have ever thought would be there to sort of, shake your hand, buy you a drink, and then sail off into the sunset, so to speak. So I just share that to Cherri, just to kind of reinforce that we just don't know who's out there for us, and usually, or sometimes, the people that we think there are the most, well, maybe they're not.
Absolutely, and thank you for sharing that story, because it really does make us stop and think about how we're living our lives, and that we can carry on in that anger, or with you and your I won't call them friends, the people that you were battling with. If there hadn't been that obituary, possibly you would have carried on the same vein. But very often it makes you stop to think, and we can release a lot of that negativity. So why not do it while we're living? You don't have to wait till someone dies to do that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So just going back to the 6 human needs, Cherri, on the two highest spiritual human needs of growth and contribution, from your own experiences, how has that contributed, you believe, to your growth?
Oh, wow. How much time have we got, Paul? Because I could be here all day. Honestly, the process has taught me so much. I am inherently somebody who likes to know a lot about what I'm doing, and obviously in the nature of my work. So I've read extensively about grief. But I think what I need to say is that when we lost our daughter, I was 41. And I pretty much thought that I had life sewn up. I was like, happy little family, mum, dad, 2 children, everything going swimmingly, business is going well. And so I was quite, arrogant, I suppose is the word. But I reckon that I had this whole life story under control. And then as life does, it sends us a curved ball. And suddenly I was completely at sea. And the level of growth has been exponential over the last 16 years and still continues even now. And I think it was I thought that I knew quite a lot about a few things before Kerry died. And what her loss made me realize is actually I know nothing. And there's so much out there that one can open ourselves to that will enhance the way we live our lives, that will enhance the way we think about things. And so it almost was like for me personally, I took on a second life after the loss of our daughter with the huge volume of things to learn. And because we are being challenged in the process of grieving, we are being challenged by overwhelming emotion. Then we'll be challenged by maybe the hurt because a friend that we thought would be there is not there. And so the journey goes on with the challenges that always seem to be rising their little heads to us. And that's where the growing happens, is each little challenge that presents itself is to say, okay, so I need to learn about this. I need to learn more about how to deal with this so that I deal with it in a positive way. And so the growth happens along the way. It happens every day. Instead of sort of big mountainous steps up and suddenly you feel you've grown a lot. So it's really only in retrospect, looking back to see the huge growth that has happened, how my views have changed in many areas, because I realize that life is short. And so does it really matter if my house is in a bit of a mess? No, it's far more important to spend time with those quality people. Does it matter that I haven't, cooked a perfect meal? No, that doesn't matter. What matters is that we give time to the people that we love. So it changed the priorities with which I was living my life. Or should I say it modified the priorities. So now I know very clearly what's important and what isn't. And that's been very liberating. So the growth has been huge. For my husband, he originally tried to block everything, couldn't cope with the emotion. And then when he fell apart, his health fell apart, he started on his grieving journey, his growth. Even at that late stage of only starting to deal with it 11 years later, his growth has also been exponential. So I do think it's a choice that we make to grow. As we've spoken, victim, I do think that it is a choice, but it's a no-brainer. Why on earth would you choose not to grow? Why on earth would you choose to stay in this really difficult place? So my whole feeling is harness the hardship, make it work for you. But if I may just mention, we started a support group for mums who had lost children called Angel Mums, because there is no term given to parents who've lost a child. If you've lost your parents, you become an orphan. If you lost your spouse, you become a widow or widower. But there is no term for people who've lost children. So we coined the term angel mums. And probably about 3 or 4 years ago, I mentioned to them and normally I didn't say very much because I was facilitating the group, but I mentioned to them that as much as one could, I feel that I've recovered. And they were very angry with me. Like, how dare I say that? And I think because some of them are locked into the victimhood, they're not going to be using this experience to grow.
Yeah.
And when I said that I had grown and would continue to grow, I think maybe they resented it a little bit. So that was an absolute eye-opener to me, that they couldn't accept that growth was a positive thing, and that a positive thing had come out of such a devastating and negative occurrence as in the loss of our children. So, yeah, that's about growth. The last of the 6 human needs is our contribution. In other words, how are we going to give or give back? And I do think that many people can't give during the process of their mourning. They too, and rightly so, they're too consumed with their own challenges and working it out for themselves. But I do think that when they are in a stronger place, they could be of immense value to other people who are now starting on the journey. But very sadly, most people don't seem to do that when we come to the topic of grieving. So we tried to start a support group at one of the retirement villages locally. And because a lot of people in those retirement villages are losing their spouses because they all are elderly when they move there. And so obviously it goes with the territory that they'll be losing their spouses. And it wasn't supported at all. So why that's happening, I'm not sure. And so many people can't really contribute well to others when they are in the grieving process and even afterwards. But I would love it if more people would be able to make themselves available so that they can treat a new mourner as such with compassion, and to be able to stand alongside them and just encourage them in a journey that is very lonely, or can be very lonely and very, very, very challenging. So why it's not happening, Paul, I don't know.
It's an interesting one on contribution, Cherri, because in my 3 pillars of life model, and I want to sort of open this up to you, if I may, and say, in your experiences of life in general, and more specifically, Cherri, around this conversation of grief, how, and I would invite you, please, to, if you like, critique it, because this model's been put out there. It's based on my own research. It's been based on my own experiences over decades. But whenever I have a conversation with anybody around any topic, be it good, bad, or indifferent, I ask them in the context of, does this model hold water? So if I may kindly ask you to indulge with me, Cherri, on this and around my 3 Ps model. The first one is purpose. And I know we've spoke around this in a previous conversation and used the analogy of a ship without a rudder. It's fair to say, isn't it, that each and every one of us needs a purpose in life, because without it, we've got no sense of direction. We don't know what we're doing. The old saying that if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for everything, a bit like a ship being tossed in life's oceans because it's got no rudder, it's got no direction, it's got no captain, it's got no nothing. So that's the first one. The first pillar is around the purpose. The second one is around prosperity, because I believe that, and yet again, this is based on decades of merely existing, that without that love, that softness, that raison d'etre, that reason to live, a flourishing, thriving, good fortune, whatever that may be. And for me, too many people put in far too stronger emphasis on money when they hear the word prosperity, but it's around that holistic well-being of, yes, I might have a couple of shillings, or not, as the case may be, but I've got good health, I've got a good heart, and that makes me a multi-billionaire without probably even realising it. And then the third one is philanthropy. And yet again, this is a word that usually raises a few eyebrows. Well, I'm not some multimillionaire that can give tens of thousands to, I don't know, schools in Africa, for example, or whatever the cause may be. But the simplicity of it for me, Cherri, the philanthropy word, coming from the Greek words of love of humanity. And surely that's kind of tied into the contribution element of, yes, we are all important, each and every one of us in this world, but I believe we have a social responsibility to contribute to the bigger picture and the world that we live in. So they are my three pillars around purpose, around prosperity, and around philanthropy. And at the risk of repeating, Cherri, I'd like to invite you to actually critique that, or not, as the case may be, in the context of your very, very challenging life over the previous few years.
Certainly, Paul, with your first pillar of purpose, it was quite amazing to me that I received, when I was about 18 years old, I received a poem about that a child is just given to you for a short time to look after, and then they go back to whatever your spiritual belief is. They go back to heaven or go back to God. Now, why was I given that poem, and why did I remember that poem? Unless part of my purpose on life was to experience the loss of a child and be able then to maybe help others in dealing with loss. And so I do feel that as far as the grieving journey is concerned, a part of our purpose is to overcome life's challenges across the board. And loss is one of them. There are very few people who will go through life never having experienced the death of a loved one. And if there are people like that, I feel sorry for them, because patently they haven't loved enough. But part of our purpose in life is, my belief, is that it's our beacon. It guides us in all we do. So if one of our purposes is to accept the challenges, be as strong as we can be, no matter what the challenges are, then that purpose can guide us and help us a lot when times are going badly. Almost like, a lighthouse being that beacon of light amongst the, when you're in the stormy seas.
Yes.
So life purpose is integral, and I certainly almost feel that I was being groomed for the loss of a child. Not that I knew that was going to be my purpose then, but from when I was little, it was just stuff that I knew. And then when Kerry did die, I remembered all of those things. So it was, as you were saying, you don't believe in coincidence, nor do I. It was like that information was preparing me for the journey that we have walked over the last few years. So I do think purpose is incredibly important. Moving on to your second pillar, which is prosperity. And I agree 100%. In fact, as you were mentioning the word prosperity, I immediately wrote down here, we're looking here at the wealth of knowledge and the wealth of the relationships of the people in our lives. And that is what makes us rich. So if you are, I'm going to link it now to the grieving, if you do have people, and it won't be a lot of people, who can walk alongside you during this journey of grieving, then you are very wealthy. but the wealth of knowledge that we gain, and we can link that to the 6 human needs, the growth of the 5th human need. The prosperity then is very rich. We are very, very wealthy if we choose to learn the lessons. And once we've learned those lessons, it allows a lot of those gentle words to come in to our lives. So instead of being hugely judgmental, we're going to probably be far more accepting and understanding. Instead of being driven to win at all costs, what we're going to do is we're going to be maybe driven to help others. So that gives us a lot of prosperity in the way we're living, but it also helps us put the idea of prosperity and generosity out into the world, which I think we are so much in need of. And that leads directly into the 3rd pillar, which is philanthropy, which I wish there was more in our world, that we weren't so concerned about us and what we are doing for ourselves. Here in South Africa, amongst the Zulu people, we have a word called Ubuntu, spelled U-B-U-N-T-U, Ubuntu, which is embracing and helping humanity. And it's a lovely principle to aspire to. And so if we can have, in getting back now to the whole grieving journey, if we can use our journeys to help others to ease their load, whether it is through doing grief workshops. I'm just trying to think what I do. I do grief workshops. I do a lot of work with hospice and Lifeline. And I know that if I hadn't experienced the loss of Kerry, I know that I wouldn't be in that position to be able to help those associations. So I think what I'm trying to say here is that many people don't harness the loss in order to maybe look at your 3 pillars, particularly the last one. And my challenge is to maybe find a way that you can help others, even if it's in a very small way, as they are traveling this journey, which is quite tough. So in essence, I think your 3 pillars can be applied to the grieving journey as well. Very, very valid.
Okay, thank you for that, Cherri. So by way of a summary then, Cherri, is there anything that you'd like to add to the I believe the immense insights that you've already shared with us? Is there anything that you feel would further enhance value to the listener?
I think there's one thing that I would like to add, Paul, and that is that when we are busy with our mourning, busy in the journey of loss, what I like to suggest to people is that they use their loved ones. So in our case, it was our daughter, Kerry. So I use Kerry every day to inspire me. And she inspires me in the work I do, she inspires me to be kinder, be more compassionate, all those things that we all are trying to be better at. And she herself she just loved everything unconditionally. She'd have to save the bees in our swimming pool before we could swim. Otherwise, they would all drown. So she was really the epitome of unconditional love. And that has challenged me hugely to aspire to how I think she would want me to be. And when you are experiencing a journey of loss, to think of that person who has now died and how they would like you to be has an enormously powerful effect in helping you just to be a little bit better than you might have been on the day. And so yes, that's kind of the last thing that I would like to add is let's use the people that have died, that are close to us, that we loved so much, and let's use them to inspire us to be better every day in the way we're living our lives.
Very poignant, Cherri, very poignant. So I think all that remains now is me to thank you, Cherri, for your, as I say, sharing your insights and your deep experiences. So yes, thank you very much indeed for that, Cherri.
Huge pleasure, Paul, and it's always lovely to be in a conversation with you. We always manage to discover lovely things together. So thank you for the opportunity.
Indeed. And also thank you to you, the listeners, for being part of this podcast episode. And until the next time, keep learning and loving. And remember, mastering life starts by embracing our hearts.
Thanks for listening to the Mastering the Game of Life podcast. Drop a line to paul@paullowehearts.com with any thoughts or questions you may have, and he'll be more than happy to respond. Alternatively, check out Paul's website at paullowehearts.com or any of his social media feeds under the same name. Remember, mastering life starts by embracing our hearts.